in terms of what you can still get from, if you're law enforcement and you're trying to find out, well, what's the data I can get from this, even if the data is encrypted in transit, you might at least be able to get what is sometimes called, correct me if I'm wrong, Arnold, pen register information. It's an old term that's kind of hung on, even though it's not really, we're not using pen registers anymore specifically, but you get information on who is communicating with whom. And that's sort of important. If you're trying to build out a terrorist network, at some point people have to communicate with each other. So you may not know the contents of the communications, but you may know that the communications occurred, that they occurred at a specific time, that they're occurring from a specific location, using a specific, application. So there are certain things that you might be able to do to still build up some useful information, even if you don't have access to the content of the information. So it's not like all is lost. Some other options are if you happen to be, the NSA or someone, and you have some sort of knowledge of a vulnerability in an encryption algorithm, you might be able to leverage that and break into end-to-end encryption. It's possible. Certainly in the public sphere, we've seen plenty of issues with SSL encryption, some of the newer versions of TLS, where they can slowly be sort of ground down, and the security can be taken down quite a few notches. You can leverage the key distribution issues, like I mentioned with the Apple iMessage setup. That's something that could be a point of failure, or depending on how you look at it, an entry point if you're law enforcement. And you could use that to try and break in. You might be able to go to, for example, Apple and Android have their own stores for applications. And if you could compel the companies running those stores, you might be able to send a vulnerable application, basically something with a built-in backdoor, to the target device. So maybe the version of WhatsApp or whatever, I'm not trying to pick on them for any particular reason, but you could send a vulnerable version, hypothetically speaking, and have that be something that has some additional capabilities built into it. So I mean, there are methods that could be used that don't necessarily involve some of the other types of specific requests that the FBI has made. And again, I'm trying to sort of generalize going forward because some of the Apple issues have been overcome by events. You could require an encryption backdoor. I believe one of the questions that we have is on the Clipper chip, so I'll save my remarks on that for a little bit later. To talk a little bit about data at rest, one of the issues, and this gets into the newer Apple phone, and this is also common in a lot of the higher-end Android phones, including the Android Samsung Knox phones, which are ones that are DoD approved. They'll store the cryptographic data on one of these secure enclaves or trusted execution environments, and these are tamper-resistant, or at the very least tamper-evident. So this is something where you have to have physical access to the device. So a lot of the stuff I just talked about for breaking into data in transit is an opportunity for mass surveillance. But if you're trying to get at data at rest, the difference is it could potentially be a lot more expensive for a one-off, but it's also something that's not generally a mass surveillance opportunity. From the hardware, there are a few ways of breaking in, and one thing is called a cold boot attack, and it's sort of an interesting attack, and you can find some reports online about it. Some people at Princeton have done some really good research into it. And the idea is if you have one of those little spray cans of spray air that you ever use to like clean your keyboard off, if you turn it upside down and spray it on the chips on a computer while it's on, you basically can freeze the chips, and it freezes the memory into them. So if you have the key that's being used to decrypt the data, and that key is held in memory, in volatile memory that would otherwise disappear when you turn the computer off, if you take one of these spray cans, you can cool down the DRAM memory quite significantly. The researchers were able to get down to about minus 50 degrees Celsius, so that's pretty cold. So you may want to be a little careful if you try that at home. I wouldn't recommend it, though. But the memory persists long enough that they're able to then read the memory off of the chips after extracting the chip. So that's one of the types of techniques you could use depending on implementation. For certain things where the memory is a little bit better protected, you could use sort of a sand and scan or delayering technique. And these are extremely expensive, require highly specialized software, but basically what you're trying to do is remove layer after layer of the chip to try to get at the memory where you can insert some probes and figure out what the ones and zeros are that are being stored in memory. So there are options. You could also, if you wanted to, if it's the government, you could require some sort of hardware backdoor. Maybe just a little toggle switch built inside the phone that you flip the switch and it turns off the trusted processing. I mean, there are options available that could be used going forward. And I'm not trying to advocate one over the other, but if there's a concern over the types of things that could enable mass surveillance versus the types of things that could be done in one-offs, there are certainly a number of options that I think are available. So certainly some of the software solutions are probably easier. Hardware stuff is pretty expensive. You need physical access. If you're trying to, from a national security perspective, gain access to a device that is physically with somebody in another country and you don't have physical access to that individual, well then, sanding and scanning the chip on their phone is not going to be an option for you, so you will need to use a different type of technique. So this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. I would say, though, that some of the big concerns I think that the tech companies have said about some of the requests made by law enforcement is there is a concern that if one of these requests, one of these government operating systems, or when we get to CALIA, I'll mention it, a vulnerability in a backdoor, if that makes it out into the wild, into the public, that could be catastrophic from a national security perspective. So there is sort of a trade-off here in terms of risk that needs to be balanced. So I gave a presentation similar to this actually at Carnegie Mellon a few days ago, and one of my colleagues said, well, it looks to me as if, it seems like right now that this is kind of like a game and there's a balance between the players. Maybe that's a sign that things are working. And I'll just kind of end with that. Not my quote, but a quote from someone else that I think is pretty smart.